The first snow had come early that year, falling in a hush over the high desert like a shroud. It blanketed the dry sage and caught in the empty fence rails, made ghosts of the mesquite trees, and wrapped the mountains in smoke-colored veils. Travelers along the old trade road had thinned to a trickle, those with sense hunkering down in canyon homesteads or crowded into saloons thick with wood smoke and low conversation. Only the desperate still moved westward now, those chased by hunger or haunted by something they couldn't outpace. He was known only as the trader to most, a solitary figure who came and went with his mule cart and weather-worn coat, selling salt, coffee, bullets, sometimes prayer beads carved from bone. His name was Silas Ward, but few bothered to ask. He had a way of being present and distant all at once, eyes always scanning the ridgeline or the sky, like he was expecting someone or something that never came. He didn't drink, didn't linger. He slept in his wagon under canvas, even when an inn would take him. Folks said he'd lost something, maybe someone, and now wandered not for profit but penance. That morning the sun was a pale coin behind the clouds, and the air tasted like metal. Silas had set up a small fire off the road where the pines grew thick, melting snow in a tin cup and warming his hands. His mule, Bramble, stood nearby, breath puffing in slow white ghosts. They were halfway between Last Chance Crossing and the abandoned mining town of Whetfield, a stretch of land as lonesome as it was beautiful. He was stirring the coffee when he heard the snow crunch. He turned, slow and careful, hand near the long knife on his belt. A girl stood at the edge of the trees. Barefoot, wrapped in little more than rags, her arms crossed tight over her chest. She looked half-starved and half-wild, black hair tangled, skin the color of honey turned cold. She didn't speak, only stared, and her eyes, those were the part that stopped him, dark as obsidian and too old for her face. "You'll freeze like that," Silas said, voice low, not unkind. She didn't answer. He rose, stepped to the wagon, pulled free a wool blanket he'd traded for back in Hawker's Ridge, thick and brown with Navajo patterns woven in faded red. He crossed the distance between them slow, like one might approach a spooked mare, and held the blanket out. The girl didn't move. "Take it," he said, "no charge." Still nothing. Then, with a hesitation that felt ancient, she stepped forward and snatched it from his hands, wrapping it around herself so quick and fierce it looked like she might disappear into it. Silas nodded once, turned back to the fire. "Got coffee if you want it." By the time he looked up again, she was gone. That should have been the end of it. A kindness given, a stranger vanished into the trees like smoke. But 2 nights later, when the fire had gone low and the sky was split with cold stars, she came back. He was awake already, though his body pretended to sleep, a habit born of years on the trail. She stood at the edge of the clearing again, still wrapped in the blanket, though it looked cleaner somehow, the pattern brighter, and in her hands she held something. A leather pouch, weathered, worn at the seams. Silas sat up slow, breath catching. That pouch was his. It had been his father's before him, carried across Missouri in a wagon train and lost, so he thought 10 winters ago on a riverbank in Utah when a storm came fast and cruel. "Where did you get that?" he asked, rising to his knees. The girl stepped closer, silent as before, and held it out. Silas took it with both hands, reverent. Inside were the old things, the coin his mother had given him, the wedding ring he never used, a folded letter never sent, a child's hair ribbon, sun-bleached and fragile, things that tethered him to a life he thought was long buried. He looked up, heart thudding. But the girl was already walking away, back into the snow-shadowed pines. The fire had long since gone out, but Silas sat beside the embers anyway, the leather pouch in his lap, his breath shallow against the chill. He turned each item over like relics, hands trembling not from cold but from the sudden, staggering return of memory. The ribbon had belonged to Lida, his daughter, the one he buried beneath a cottonwood tree after the fever took her, or thought he had. The mind did strange things in grief. He had packed that pouch with pieces of himself, lost it in the flood, and spent the next 10 years convincing himself none of it had mattered, that nothing could be recovered. But here it was, and with it the girl, silent, unclaimed by the land or any known trail. He slept little that night, turning over thoughts like stones, trying to catch the shape of what had happened. By morning, there was no sign of her but a faint trail of footprints that ended just past the tree line, swallowed by fresh snow. Silas moved on, but slower now. Each town along the way he watched for her questioned a few souls without seeming too curious. Descriptions brought only shrugs or superstitious warnings. If she's walkin' barefoot and don't talk, one barkeep muttered in Cutter's Hollow, she ain't a girl, she's something else. He spat into the sawdust. Old lands hold old spirits. You gave her warmth, maybe she owes you now. Silas dismissed it outwardly, but alone on the trail, he kept glancing over his shoulder. The roads grew meaner as winter set in. Twice he found wagons tipped into ravines, frostbit bodies stiff in the snow. Hunger drove people to desperate ends. He traded where he could, left food with a woman and her 3 boys huddled in a half-collapsed sod house. Gave firesteel to a miner too weak to dig. With each small act he caught himself listening, waiting, not for thanks, but for the soft rustle of feet in the snow. She did not come. Then came the pass. It was called Widow's Spine, a narrow route through the high cliffs where wind howled like a thing with teeth. Silas had no intention of crossing until spring, but a rancher had begged him to deliver medicine to his brother's child in Tiller's Gap, and Silas, against his better sense, agreed. On the second day, the snow thickened. Bramble grew nervous, ears twitching. Silas wrapped himself in every blanket he had but still felt the cold seep through his bones like smoke through floorboards. They camped in a notch between 2 shale outcroppings, firelight flickering against the stone. That night the wind dropped, and for a brief, impossible span, silence fell. She appeared again, standing just outside the fire's reach, still barefoot, though the snow came past her ankles now. The blanket clung to her like a second skin. Silas didn't rise this time, he only looked. "You got a name?" he asked softly. She tilted her head, as if considering. "You from around here?" She stepped closer, and in her hands was something new. A brooch, tarnished silver with a turquoise stone, the pin bent near to breaking. Silas took it like a man lifting something sacred. He stared, stunned. "This was my sister," he murmured. "God above, I gave it to her before she went west with her husband. Wagon train vanished near the San Juans, never found a thing." The girl said nothing. Her eyes shimmered with reflected firelight. How do you have this?" No answer, only the wind picking up again, soft at first, then rising. But before she turned to leave, the girl looked at him, truly looked. And in that moment, Silas saw not a ghost or a spirit or even a lost child, but a presence, something threaded between the living and the dead. A witness, a keeper. "Wait," he said, rising despite the cold, despite his trembling limbs. "Why me?" She paused, then knelt in the snow. With a finger, she drew a shape in the frost. A circle, a dot at its center, then she was gone again. Silas stared at the shape, heart-pounding. It meant nothing or everything. A mark of return, of belonging, of something lost circling back. He didn't sleep that night, didn't move, just watched the dark. And when dawn came, he packed the wagon and began again, but not toward Tiller's Gap. He turned back toward Whetfield, toward the place he lost the pouch. Toward the past. The road back to Whetfield was mostly gone, swallowed by years of landslides and neglect. What had once been a mining trail was now little more than a memory winding through shale and brittle pine. Silas guided Bramble with care, the wagon groaning beneath supplies grown meager. He had not seen another soul in days, only the wide white hush of snowfall and the occasional crow watching from the trees with eyes like spilled ink. Something in him had shifted since that last night by the fire. It wasn't belief, exactly. Silas had never taken to spirits or signs, but the brooch had been real, the pouch had been real, and the girl, whatever she was, had left a mark deeper than fear or reason. She was a stitch between old wounds, and something told him Whetfield held the thread she followed. He arrived in the late dusk of a colorless day. The town lay half-buried beneath drifts, its buildings slumped like broken teeth against the gray horizon. Only a few structures still stood in full, the old general store, the blacksmith shed, and the chapel, leaning slightly as if bowing to time. He tethered Bramble near a crumbling hitch post and stepped into the silence. Inside the store he found the bones of the past, rusted tins, a shattered mirror, a coat rack still bearing a single moth-eaten scarf. He ran his fingers over the counter where he'd once bartered for copper kettles and lamp oil. He had passed through Whetfield 10 years before with his wife and daughter, trying to sell seed and soap to men already drunk on gold dreams. It had been a harsh winter then, too, and they'd pressed on after one night, choosing the southern trail. The storm that took Lida had come not long after. He moved to the riverbank beyond town, the place where the pouch had slipped from the wagon during the flood. The water ran slower now, thick with slush, but the trees still leaned over the edge, stark and familiar. He knelt by the roots of a black alder and touched the earth as if to ask forgiveness. And then he heard her. Not footsteps, not a voice, just the barest inhale. He turned and she stood across the river. No longer a girl, not truly. Her bearing was older, her gaze calmer, but the blanket still clung to her shoulders and her feet remained bare. "You follow memory," she said, and this time her voice reached him, thin but clear. "But it doesn't stay still." Silas rose, heart tight. "Why show me these things?" "Because you still carry weight." She stepped to the river's edge. "You never put them down." "I buried my girl," he whispered. "I mourned her." "You buried her body," the girl said, "but not her light." The cold bit through his coat as he waded into the shallows. The current tugged at his legs, the water sharp and cruel. He reached her side, soaked to the waist. She didn't move, only watched him with an expression that was not pity but understanding. "You know what I've lost," he said. She nodded. "I hold what others let fall, but it is not mine to keep." She lifted a small parcel wrapped in oilskin. Silas took it with numb hands. Inside was a child's sketch, crude and crumpled, the colors faded, a horse, a star, and three figures, stick-armed and smiling. He had drawn it for Lida during their long travel west. He thought it burned with their wagon in the flood. He sank to his knees, the ice clawing at him. "Where are you from?" "I walk the places memory hides," she said. "Some things that are lost aren't meant to stay that way." "Are you alive?" he asked, barely able to shape the words. She stepped back, out of reach. "Not in the way you mean." The wind lifted, stirring her hair. She turned, and in the blink of a moment, she was gone again. But the sketch remained, and with it a new ache, not the wound of grief, but its release. That night Silas built no fire. He sat in the old chapel, surrounded by snow-dusted pews, and held the drawing close. For the first time in years, he spoke to Lida out loud, told her about the mountains she'd never seen, the strangers he'd helped, the hunger he'd outlasted. And somewhere in that half-prayer, half-confession, he felt the quietest warmth bloom behind his ribs. Not forgiveness, not quite. But the start of it. Snow melted slow in the weeks that followed. Not by sun, there was little of that, but by the sheer relentlessness of time. Winds shifted, and the cold became less cruel, more mournful. Silas remained in Whetfield longer than he'd meant to, drawn not by comfort, but by a strange sense of tending. He patched the roof of the chapel with salvaged wood, cleared debris from the walkways, left dry food in the store's cellar where raccoons and crows might find it. It wasn't revival, just respect. The girl didn't return. Not in sight, at least, but signs of her lingered. A carved feather in the windowsill, a scrap of blue cloth tied to the alder tree. Once a trail of wild rose petals led to the river and vanished at the bank. Silas no longer questioned it. The land held memory the way a body holds pain, not always visible, but always there if pressed. He'd nearly decided to move on when the boy arrived. It was dusk. Silas was mending a split in Bramble's harness when the sound of hooves came slow and uneven down the old trail. The boy looked near 12, pale and hollow-eyed, riding a donkey too thin for the saddle. He slumped forward as though barely conscious, one arm bound in cloth soaked through with blood. Silas caught him before he fell. There was no time for questions. He laid the boy in the chapel, boiled water, cleaned the wound, gunshot, ragged and hot with infection. Silas had seen worse, but not in someone so young. He worked through the night, wrapping, cooling, murmuring the low, steady reassurances he once spoke to Lida when her fever raged. At dawn, the boy stirred. "Thought I was dead," he whispered. "Not today," Silas said, easing broth to his lips. The boy's name was Thomas. Said he'd run from a gang near Flint Ridge, men who'd taken his older sister and tried to press him into labor. He'd escaped with the donkey and been riding 3 days before the shot caught him. His words came slow, fractured by fever, but the truth was plain. He had no one else. Silas didn't think, he stayed, fed him, tended the wound, told stories from the trail when the boy's eyes grew distant. And when Thomas asked why he'd helped, Silas only said, "Someone gave me something once. I'm returning the favor." Weeks passed, snow thinned to mud, and the wind turned wet. The boy grew stronger, stubborn. He followed Silas on short walks, asked about herbs and knots, learned to patch saddle leather and recognize false trails. He took to Bramble like a brother. There was no talk of leaving. And then, on a rain-dark morning, the girl came again. Thomas saw her first. He'd gone to fetch kindling and froze on the threshold. "There's someone," he said, voice gone quiet. Silas followed him out. She stood near the river, not barefoot now but in soft doeskin moccasins, still wearing the wool blanket like a shroud. In her hands was a piece of wood, shaped and dark. Silas crossed to her, heart steady. She held out the carving, a sparrow, wings tucked, eyes sharp. He took it gently. "My wife carved these," he said softly. "She'd trade them to travelers. I kept one, but it broke the winter she died." "This one never did," the girl replied. "She left it with me." Silas felt Thomas come to his side. The boy stared, mouth slightly open. "She's real," he whispered. The girl looked at him, not with surprise, but with the calm recognition of someone who has been waiting. "You," she said, "have more to lose and more to give." Thomas blinked. What does that mean? But she was already stepping back. Silas called out, "Why me, all this time?" She paused, then spoke without turning, "Because you remembered." And then she was gone again, into mist, into memory. They stood long in the silence after. Later, inside the chapel, Thomas traced the carving with his fingers. "You think she's a ghost?" Silas shook his head. "No, ghosts are echoes. She's something else, a keeper of what matters." He looked at the boy. "Some things were given back, some things we pass forward." And in the quiet that followed, Thomas reached over and placed the sparrow on the windowsill, where the light might find it. Spring announced itself not with blossoms, but with breath, the slow exhale of snowmelt, the loosening of roots beneath thawed soil. Whetfield remained a skeleton town, bones of the old life poking through fresh grass, but in its quiet, a new rhythm had taken hold. Silas and Thomas moved like men returned from something vast and wordless. There was work enough to keep them grounded, mending harnesses, gathering early greens, digging a shallow cistern near the chapel. They spoke little of the girl, yet her presence stitched through everything. One morning, while walking the ridge east of town, Thomas spotted a trail of dark feathers, one after another, evenly spaced, leading down toward the canyon bend. "You think it's from her?" he asked, voice tight with wonder. Silas knelt, touched one gently. "Maybe, or maybe it's just a crow." But they followed the trail anyway. It led them to the rim of the gorge, where the river narrowed and rushed fierce between jagged stone. There, balanced on a flat rock like an offering, was a journal, water-warped and bound in cracked leather. Silas picked it up with a slow reverence, thumbing through pages written in a fine, neat hand. He stopped on a name. "Emmeline Ward." He sat down hard. "That's your name," Thomas said, leaning close. "She was my wife," Silas said, voice rasping. "I thought this was lost with her wagon when she left Whetfield that winter to find her sister. They never made it." He turned another page. It was a sketch, rough but loving, of a girl with dark hair and a wool blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders. Below it, a single line, "If you find her, you will have found me too." Silas closed the book and stared out over the canyon, wind lifting his hair. She knew. Somehow she knew the girl, or what she'd become. Thomas sat beside him, legs dangling over the edge. "Maybe she wasn't meant to be found until you were ready." Silas nodded slowly. "Maybe." They buried the journal in the chapel's foundation that evening, wrapped in oilskin and set beneath the stone threshold. "Not to forget," Silas said as they worked, "but to remember with peace." That night the wind blew warmer, a soft, wood-smoke-sweet breeze that stirred the curtains and carried faint sounds from the canyon, almost like humming, almost like laughter. In the days that followed, others began to pass through. A widow with her boy, fleeing debts in the north. A farmer whose land had turned to dust. A quiet couple who had lost a child and could no longer bear the company of familiar fields. Silas offered food, fire, shelter. Thomas showed them where the cold water ran clear, where wild onions grew. Word spread slow but sure. A place beyond the ridge, not quite a town, not yet a home, but safe. They began to build, not from ambition but necessity. A longhouse for travelers, a smokehouse, a new fence around the chapel. Each board nailed with shared silence, each meal eaten beneath a roof that had once known only ghosts. One afternoon, while sorting old trade goods, Silas found the ribbon again, the one from his daughter. It was frayed now, nearly colorless. He sat a long while thinking of Lida, of Emmeline, of the girl who had walked barefoot through snow carrying the weight of memory. He stood, took the ribbon outside, and tied it to the branch of the alder tree near the river. The wind caught it, lifted it gently. Thomas joined him, hands dusty from the day's work. "Think she'll come back?" "She never really left," Silas said. And as they turned to go, the clouds parted, just slightly, and the last light of day touched the ribbon, turning it briefly gold. By summer the land had softened. Whetfield still called that, though its soul had shifted, breathed a little easier with every new sunrise. Wild grasses pushed through broken boardwalks, bees drifted among the ruins of old miners' shacks, and in the evenings, firelight flickered from cabin windows like the slow beating of a heart. It wasn't a resurrection. It was a quiet kind of becoming. Silas stood most mornings near the chapel's threshold, mug of boiled chicory in hand, watching the smoke rise from new chimneys. He stopped asking questions of the wind. The answers, it seemed, arrived when they pleased. He simply listened now, and that was enough. Thomas had grown in more ways than height. The narrow fear had left his shoulders, replaced by a steadiness born of belonging. He could set a snare, start a fire from wet wood, and read the weather like a second language. He called Silas "old man" sometimes, with a grin that spoke of both mischief and love. And though neither said it aloud, the bond between them had settled deep as bedrock. It was during one of those high blue days in late August that they found her again. Silas and Thomas were mending the gate along the north trail when they heard the sound, like wind through tall grass, but steadier. When they turned, she was there, just beyond the fence line, standing at the edge of the tall golden rye that had taken root on its own. The girl, or something like her. She was older now, though not by years. Her eyes carried seasons. Her blanket was folded across her arm, not worn, and she stood with a posture of calm conclusion, as though she had reached the end of a long journey and found herself where she was meant to be. They approached slowly. Thomas said nothing, but his hand brushed Silas's briefly, just to make sure this moment was shared, not dreamt. "I've come to return one last thing," she said. She reached into the folds of her coat and brought out a watch. Silver dented on the edge, chain snapped. Silas's breath caught. "My father," he said. "I gave it to a man in exchange for passage through the pass. Years before Lida was born, I never saw it again." She placed it in his hands. "He gave it away, but I kept it." Silas ran his thumb over the etched initials. "Why?" She looked toward the fields, toward the chapel, the cabins, the low laughter drifting from the far pasture. "Because some losses are seeds," she said, "and if you carry them long enough, they grow into what comes next." She turned then, not vanishing, not fading, just walking, as any woman might walk from one place to another. Her feet pressed grass, bent it gently. She moved toward the ridgeline, where the sun crowned the hills in gold. Silas and Thomas watched her go. They didn't follow. They didn't need to. That night they lit lanterns along the chapel fence. Others came, unasked, bringing music, bread, a little whiskey. A circle formed. No speeches, no sermons, just people, tired and mended in pieces, choosing to share the same fire. Silas sat with Thomas beside him, the sparrow carving now hanging above the chapel door. The ribbon, weather-worn, still danced from the alder's branch, catching starlight. "I used to think home was a place I left behind," Silas said, watching the glow rise. Thomas looked at him, quiet. "What is it now?" Silas smiled, slow and worn. "Something I built by staying." And as night fell over the reborn bones of Whetfield, the wind carried no ghosts. Only warmth, only memory, only the long, steady hush of healing.